The autumn of 1887 brought more than just fallen leaves to the struggling farming community of Cedar Falls, Missouri. It brought Rebecca Thompson face to face with a betrayal so devastating that it would either destroy her family forever or transform them into the most powerful women in the American West. When her father's creditors gathered on their front porch with legal documents and cold determination, she had no idea that a mysterious stranger's intervention would unleash a chain of events involving hidden fortunes, railroad empires, and four sisters who would redefine what it meant to be free women in 19th century America. What began as the darkest moment in their family's history would become the foundation for an empire that would span 3 states and challenge every assumption about women's capabilities in frontier society. The man who stepped forward to change their destiny carried secrets that would reshape not only their lives, but the entire economic landscape of the expanding American frontier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Thompson family farm like a burial shroud, obscuring the rolling hills of Missouri farmland that had been their home for 3 generations. Rebecca Thompson stood at the kitchen window, watching the dew collect on pumpkin vines that would never see harvest, her calloused hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that held the last of their coffee. At 24, she possessed the kind of determined beauty that frontier life had refined rather than diminished. Sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, auburn hair that caught sunlight even on the greyest days, and the straight-backed posture of a woman who had learned to carry burdens that would break weaker spirits. The sound of approaching wagons cut through the morning silence, their iron-shod wheels grinding against the rutted dirt road that led to the Thompson homestead. Rebecca's stomach clenched as she counted the vehicles. 5 wagons, more than had ever visited their property for any pleasant purpose. She recognized the lead wagon as belonging to Silas Morrison, the bank president whose cold efficiency had become legendary throughout Cedar County. Behind him rode men she knew by reputation, if not by name, debt collectors, legal representatives, and the kind of businessmen who thrived on other people's misfortunes. "Girls," Rebecca called quietly, her voice carrying the authority that came from being the eldest daughter in a household where their father had long since abdicated responsibility. "Come downstairs, all of you, now." Her 3 sisters appeared, with the synchronized obedience that came from years of crisis management. Margaret, 22, possessed the kind of delicate beauty that belonged in parlors rather than farmhouses, her golden hair always perfectly arranged despite their circumstances, her green eyes holding dreams of a different life. Sarah, 19, had inherited their mother's artistic temperament along with her dark hair and expressive brown eyes, her fingers perpetually stained with ink from the letters she wrote to newspapers and magazines in distant cities. The youngest, Catherine, just 17, combined their father's stubborn streak with a sharp intelligence that had impressed every schoolteacher Cedar Falls had managed to keep for more than a year. "Is it the bank?" Margaret asked, though they all knew the answer. The monthly visits from Morrison's representatives had been growing more frequent and more insistent as their father's debts accumulated beyond any reasonable hope of repayment. Rebecca nodded grimly. "More than just the bank this time? Looks like every creditor in 3 counties decided to pay us a visit." She set down her coffee mug and straightened her worn but clean dress, the blue cotton fabric patched in places but maintained with the pride that poverty hadn't yet managed to destroy. "Remember what we discussed. Let me do the talking. No matter what they propose or threaten, we present a united front." The sisters took their positions in the small parlor, a room that had once showcased their mother's taste for beautiful things. but now displayed only the bare necessities that hadn't yet been sold to meet their father's obligations. The horsehair sofa where their mother had entertained the wives of Cedar Falls' most prominent citizens was covered with a quilt Rebecca had sewn to hide the worn upholstery. The mahogany piano that had been Margaret's pride and joy stood silent, its keys yellowed and several strings broken beyond their ability to repair. Thomas Thompson emerged from his bedroom like a condemned man approaching the gallows, his once powerful frame now bent with shame and alcohol, his grey hair unkempt, and his clothes bearing the rumpled appearance of a man who had given up on maintaining dignity. At 52, he looked a decade older, his blue eyes clouded with the defeated expression of someone who had watched his dreams crumble beneath the weight of poor decisions and cruel fate. The knock on their front door came with the authoritative rap of men who expected immediate compliance. Rebecca opened it to find Silas Morrison standing on their porch, his black suit immaculate despite the morning's travel, his silver pocket watch chain catching the weak sunlight. Behind him stood Harold Kemper, the county's most ruthless debt collector, and three other men whose presence suggested this visit involved more than routine financial discussion. "Mr. Thompson," Morrison said with the cold politeness that characterized all his business dealings, "I believe you know why we're here. The grace period we discussed last month has expired, and your financial obligations remain unresolved." Thompson's voice cracked as he attempted to respond. "Mr. Morrison, I've been expecting some income from the wheat sale, and there's still the possibility of—" "The wheat crop failed, Thomas," Kemper interrupted with brutal directness. "Same as it did last year and the year before. The land's played out, the equipment's mortgaged beyond its value, and your debts now exceed $15,000 with accumulated interest." The figure struck the family like a physical blow. $15,000 represented more money than most farmers in Cedar County would see in their entire lifetimes. It was an impossible sum that transformed their situation from difficult to utterly hopeless. Rebecca stepped forward, her protective instincts overriding her father's authority in the household. "Gentlemen, surely some arrangement can be made. Payment plans, additional collateral, seasonal work agreements." Morrison's laugh held no humor. "Miss Thompson, your family's debt exceeds the value of this property by a factor of 3 to 1. The bank has been extraordinarily patient, but patience doesn't pay creditors or satisfy legal obligations." He withdrew a sheaf of legal documents from his leather case. "Miss, we've come to discuss the final resolution of this matter." The formal language couldn't disguise what Rebecca recognized as the end of everything they had ever known. Foreclosure proceedings, asset liquidation, and the kind of financial destruction that would scatter their family across the frontier like leaves in a winter storm. "There is, however, an alternative," Morrison continued, his tone suggesting he was about to present something he considered generous. "Mr. Kemper has identified several parties interested in resolving your debts through unconventional means." Harold Kemper stepped forward, his thin frame and pale complexion giving him the appearance of an undertaker conducting business. "The frontier territories are experiencing unprecedented growth, creating opportunities for workforce solutions that benefit all parties involved. Your daughters are educated, healthy, and possess the kind of practical skills that frontier communities desperately need." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air as she began to understand the direction of this conversation. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Kemper?" "Marriage arrangements," Kemper replied with the matter-of-fact tone of a man discussing livestock transactions. "Verified bachelors in Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado territories have expressed interest in wives who can contribute immediately to frontier households. Teachers, seamstresses, cooks, housekeepers, your daughters possess qualifications that command premium marriage contracts." Margaret gasped audibly, while Sarah's face flushed with indignation. Catherine remained silent, but Rebecca could see. Her youngest sister's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white with suppressed rage. "Marriage contracts," Rebecca repeated slowly, ensuring she understood the full implications of what was being suggested. "You're proposing to sell my sisters to strangers as payment for my father's debts. I prefer the term arranged marriages with financial considerations," Morrison said smoothly. "It's a practice with historical precedent throughout the American territories. Frontier men require wives, educated women require security and protection, and financial obligations require resolution. This arrangement addresses all three needs simultaneously." Thomas Thompson had collapsed into his worn armchair, his head buried in his hands as the reality of their situation overwhelmed him. The man who had once proudly worked 300 acres of Missouri farmland was now listening to strangers discuss selling his daughters like commodities in a marketplace. "The process would be conducted through legal auction," Kemper explained, apparently interpreting their stunned silence as interest rather than horror. "Public notice, competitive bidding, binding contracts that ensure the welfare and protection of all parties involved. Your father's debts would be completely resolved, and your sisters would be guaranteed marriages to financially stable men in growing communities." Rebecca's mind raced through the implications while her sisters looked to her for leadership. An auction would mean public humiliation beyond anything their family had previously endured. It would mean separation, possibly permanent, as her sisters were scattered across the Western territories to fulfill contracts with men they had never met. Most importantly, it would mean the complete destruction of their autonomy as free women capable of making their own choices about their futures. But the alternative was equally devastating. Foreclosure would leave them destitute and homeless, with no resources and no prospects in a society that offered limited opportunities for unmarried women without family support. They would face potential starvation, exploitation, or worse as they struggled to survive without protection or financial security. "How much time do we have to consider this proposal?" Rebecca asked, stalling for time while she tried to formulate some alternative plan. "The auction is scheduled for Saturday morning," Morrison replied, consulting his pocket watch. 3 days from now. Public notice has already been posted throughout the county, and we've received inquiries from as far away as Denver and Salt Lake City. 3 days. Rebecca felt the walls of their world closing in around them as she realized how thoroughly their situation had been planned and orchestrated. The creditors hadn't come to negotiate or offer alternatives. They had come to announce decisions that had already been made, legal proceedings that were already in motion, and a future that had been determined without their input or consent. "There is one other consideration," Morrison added, his tone suggesting reluctance to discuss additional complications. "The auction will be conducted according to territorial law, which means the highest bidders will have complete authority over their acquisitions. Marriage is the expected outcome, but the legal framework provides considerable discretion regarding specific arrangements." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the chilling implication that her sisters' fates would be entirely dependent on the character and intentions of whoever purchased their marriage contracts. Good men might indeed be seeking wives and companions, but frontier territories also attracted individuals whose motivations were far less honorable. "I need to discuss this with my sisters," Rebecca said, though she knew there was nothing to discuss. They had no legal standing to refuse, no financial resources to offer alternatives, and no family members who could provide assistance or refuge. "Of course," Morrison agreed with false courtesy. "We'll return Friday morning to finalize the arrangements and ensure everything proceeds according to legal requirements." As the creditors departed, leaving behind their legal documents and ultimatums, Rebecca found herself facing the most impossible decision of her life. Submission to the auction meant sacrificing her sister's freedom and futures to resolve debts they hadn't created. Resistance meant condemning them all to destitution and potential starvation in a world that offered few opportunities for women without family protection. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her desperate contemplation. A single rider was approaching their property, moving with the confident pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going and why he was going there. Even from a distance, Rebecca could see this was not another debt collector or legal representative. The horse was a magnificent sorrel stallion that spoke of wealth and quality breeding, while its rider sat with the straight-backed authority of a man accustomed to command. As the stranger drew closer, Rebecca found herself studying a figure who seemed to have stepped out of the legendary stories told about the American frontier. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with the kind of broad shoulders and powerful build that came from years of physical labor rather than gymnasium exercise. His dark hair was longer than Eastern fashion dictated, but perfectly suited to a man who lived by his own rules, and his weathered face showed laugh lines around grey eyes that seemed to take in everything with calculating intelligence. Most striking was his clothing, which spoke of wealth without ostentation. His leather coat was expertly tailored but practical. His boots were handmade but well worn, and his gun belt showed the kind of maintenance that suggested both competence and regular use. This was clearly a man of substance, but substance earned through frontier success rather than inherited Eastern privilege. The stranger reined in his horse directly in front of their porch, touching the brim of his hat with the courteous gesture of a man who understood proper behavior around ladies. Regardless of circumstances, when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made people listen without raising volume. "Miss Thompson, I believe. My name is Jackson Sterling. I understand your family is facing some difficulties that might benefit from outside perspective." Rebecca studied the stranger's face, searching for the calculating coldness she had seen in their creditor's expressions, but finding instead something that might have been genuine concern, mixed with carefully controlled anger. "Mr. Sterling, if you're here about the auction, I should tell you that we haven't accepted the inevitability of that situation. I'm here because word travels fast in frontier communities, and what I heard this morning made me ride harder than I've ridden in years." Sterling's grey eyes hardened as he continued. "Men who would auction women to settle debts those women didn't create deserve to have their assumptions challenged by someone with the resources to make such challenges effective." Something in his tone suggested Jackson Sterling was not a man whose challenges were easily dismissed. Rebecca felt a flutter of hope that she immediately tried to suppress, knowing that hope in their situation was a luxury they couldn't afford. "Mr. Sterling, I appreciate whatever sympathy you might feel for our situation, but our debts are very real and our options extremely limited." Sterling dismounted with fluid grace and approached their porch, his spurs ringing softly against the wooden steps. Up close, Rebecca could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind, and the calloused hands that indicated familiarity with ropes, tools, and weapons. This was undoubtedly a man who had built his success through personal effort rather than family advantage. "Miss Thompson, I own the largest ranch operation in Montana Territory, with additional properties in Wyoming and Colorado. I employ over 200 people directly and influence the livelihood of thousands more through my business decisions." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "When I say your family's options aren't as limited as they appear, I'm speaking from a position of considerable resources and even more considerable determination." Rebecca found herself studying this unexpected visitor with growing amazement. If Jackson Sterling was telling the truth about his holdings and influence, He represented the kind of wealth and power that could indeed challenge their creditors' assumptions. But she had learned to be cautious about men who made grand promises during desperate times. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Sterling? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jackson Sterling's grey eyes swept across the worn porch, taking in details that spoke of a family's gradual descent from prosperity to desperation. The freshly mended railings, the carefully patched roof shingles, the flower boxes that still held late-season blooms despite everything else falling apart. These were the marks of people who refused to surrender dignity even when surrendering everything else. What I'm proposing, Miss Thompson, is considerably more complex than what your creditors offered, but infinitely more respectful of your family's humanity. Sterling removed his leather gloves with deliberate precision, his hands revealing calluses that spoke of genuine work rather than genteel recreation. I'm prepared to purchase your father's entire debt obligation, all $15,000 plus accumulated interest, directly from his creditors. Rebecca felt her breath catch. The sum he mentioned so casually represented more money than she had ever imagined one person could possess, let alone spend on strangers, and in return, employment contracts. Legitimate legal agreements that would bring you and your sisters to my Montana operations as valued employees rather than commodities. Sterling's voice hardened on the final word, his contempt for the proposed auction unmistakable. Teachers for the ranch children, bookkeepers for my business operations, medical care for my workers, supervisors for my household staff, positions that would utilize your actual skills rather than simply your availability. Margaret stepped forward, her refined features animated by the first hope Rebecca had seen in weeks. Employment? Real work with wages and independence? Complete independence, Sterling confirmed, his attention shifting to include all. 4 sisters in the conversation, separate quarters, individual contracts, full authority over your personal decisions, including marriage, travel, or career changes. The only obligation would be fulfilling your employment duties, which I suspect you could accomplish with considerably more competence than most people I've hired. Sarah, whose artistic temperament had been increasingly stifled by their circumstances, found her voice for the first time since the creditor's departure. What kind of operations are we discussing? How large is your enterprise? Sterling's expression grew more animated as he described his holdings, clearly a man who took pride in what he had built. The primary ranch covers 40,000 acres of prime grazing land in the Gallatin Valley. We run approximately 8,000 head of cattle, 1,200 horses, and maintain the largest sheep operation in Montana Territory. Beyond livestock, I own silver mines in Colorado, timber operations in Wyoming, and transportation interests that include stage lines and freight companies across 3 territories. The scope of his enterprise was staggering. Rebecca found herself trying to comprehend wealth and influence that dwarfed anything she had encountered, even in the stories about Eastern industrial magnates that occasionally appeared in newspapers. This was frontier success on a scale that challenged every assumption about what individual achievement could accomplish. The ranch headquarters alone employs 65 people year-round, Sterling continued. Foremen, cowboys, blacksmiths, carpenters, cooks, seamstresses, teachers for the workers' children, bookkeepers, and medical personnel. During roundup and shipping seasons, that number doubles. Quality employees are the scarcest commodity on the frontier, which is why I'm prepared to invest significantly in acquiring the right people. Catherine, whose sharp intelligence had been frustrated by their limited circumstances, stepped forward with the directness that characterized her approach to complex problems. Mr. Sterling, your offer sounds extraordinarily generous, but it also sounds too convenient. Men don't ride hundreds of miles to rescue families they've never met unless they have compelling personal motivations. Sterling smiled for the first time since his arrival, apparently appreciating Catherine's skepticism. "Miss Catherine, it is Catherine, isn't it? You're absolutely correct to question my motivations. The truth is both simpler and more complex than pure altruism." He gestured toward the distant horizon, where rolling hills stretched toward territories that most Missouri farmers would never see. "I've been searching for over 2 years for qualified personnel to manage expanding operations. Traditional recruitment methods have proved inadequate. Cowboys and laborers are available, but finding educated, reliable individuals who can handle administrative responsibilities has been nearly impossible." Rebecca studied Sterling's face, searching for deception or hidden agendas, but finding only what appeared to be straightforward business reasoning. "You're suggesting this is purely a commercial transaction disguised as charity?" "I'm suggesting this is a business opportunity that serves everyone's interests while preventing an injustice that violates every principle I consider important." Sterling's voice carried quiet intensity that suggested personal convictions rather than mere financial calculations. "Your family gains financial freedom and career opportunities. My operations gain qualified personnel who understand responsibility and hard work. The alternative, watching educated women be sold like livestock to settle debts they didn't create, benefits no one except the predators who profit from other people's desperation." Thomas Thompson finally raised his head, his voice cracked with shame as he spoke for the first time since the creditor's departure. "Mr. Sterling, I don't understand why a man of your apparent success would involve himself in the troubles of a failed farmer and his family. What guarantee do you have that we're worth such an investment?" Sterling's attention shifted to the broken man who had once owned 300 acres of productive farmland. Rather than the contempt Rebecca expected, his expression showed something approaching compassion, mixed with hard-earned wisdom. "Mr. Thompson, I've spent 15 years building my operations from nothing. I started with a single horse, $200, and more determination than sense. Success taught me that people's circumstances don't always reflect their capabilities, and that talent often emerges in the most unexpected places." He paused, studying the worn but well-maintained homestead around them. "This property shows evidence of skilled management and careful maintenance, despite impossible financial pressures. That tells me more about your family's character than any bank ledger could reveal." Rebecca felt tears threatening as she recognized the first positive assessment their family had received in months. Every neighbor, every merchant, every person of influence in Cedar County had come to regard the Thompsons as failures whose troubles were probably deserved. Sterling's acknowledgement of their efforts and capabilities touched something deep inside her that had been slowly dying under the weight of constant criticism and social condemnation. "The employment contracts would be structured as follows," Sterling continued, withdrawing legal documents from his coat. 5-year agreements with guaranteed salary, housing, and benefits. Miss Rebecca would serve as administrative supervisor for ranch operations, managing personnel records, supply ordering, and financial documentation. Miss Margaret would establish and direct educational programs for workers' families with full authority over curriculum and teaching methods. Margaret's eyes brightened as she realized the scope of what was being offered. Her dreams of teaching had been frustrated by their circumstances, but Sterling was proposing opportunities that exceeded anything available in rural Missouri. How many children would be involved in these educational programs? Currently, 43, children ranging from 6 to 16 years old, with additional families joining our operations regularly. You'd have complete autonomy to design programs that meet their specific needs, plus funding for books, supplies, and equipment. Sterling handed Margaret a detailed document that outlined educational responsibilities and resources. The goal is preparing these children for success in expanding frontier communities, which requires considerably more comprehensive education than most rural schools provide. Sarah stepped forward eagerly. And what opportunities would be available for someone with writing and artistic interests? Extensive correspondence with suppliers, customers, and business partners requires skilled writers who can represent our operations professionally. Additionally, I've been considering establishing a territorial newspaper to serve scattered communities throughout our region. Sterling's proposal addressed Sarah's creative ambitions while providing practical applications for her skills. Someone with journalistic talent could help develop communication networks that would benefit entire communities while building a personal reputation in expanding markets. The scope of what Sterling was offering began to sink in as Rebecca realized. He wasn't simply providing employment, but creating opportunities for her sisters to build careers that could establish them as influential figures in frontier society. Instead of being auctioned as commodities, they would become professionals whose skills and contributions were valued and compensated. Catherine would work directly with me on expansion planning, property development, and new business ventures. Sterling continued, his proposal addressing each sister's specific capabilities. Someone with her analytical abilities could help identify opportunities that less systematic thinkers might miss. Frontier business success often depends on seeing possibilities that others overlook. Catherine's sharp intelligence had been her greatest frustration in their limited rural environment. Sterling was offering her challenges that would test her abilities while providing education in business methods that few women ever encountered. What kind of expansion planning? New properties, different industries, territorial development, all of those and more. Montana Territory is experiencing unprecedented growth. Railroad construction, mining development, agricultural expansion, commercial opportunities. Someone with analytical skills and local knowledge could help direct that growth in ways that benefit entire communities while generating substantial profits. Sterling's vision encompassed economic development on a regional scale. The next 10 years will determine which communities prosper and which ones stagnate. Strategic planning during this period could influence territorial development. For generations, Rebecca found herself overwhelmed by the transformation Sterling was proposing. Instead of scattered separation and uncertain fates, her sisters would remain together while pursuing careers that utilized their individual talents. Instead of dependence on unknown men in remote territories, they would maintain independence, while building professional reputations in growing communities. The financial arrangements, she asked, forcing herself to address practical considerations despite her growing excitement. Each sister would receive individual salaries ranging from $800 to $1,200 annually, plus housing, meals, and benefits. For comparison, most territorial teachers earn $200 to $300 per year when they can find employment at all. Sterling's compensation levels reflected the value he placed on skilled personnel. Additionally, performance bonuses and profit-sharing opportunities would provide incentives for exceptional contributions. The amounts he mentioned represented wealth beyond anything the Thompson sisters had ever imagined earning through their own efforts. Combined, their salaries would exceed the income their father had generated during his most successful farming years, while providing security and independence that no rural agricultural operation could offer. "There's one additional consideration," Sterling said, his tone becoming more serious. "Accepting these positions would require relocating to Montana Territory permanently. The distances and seasonal weather make casual travel between territories impractical. You'd be committing to building new lives in communities very different from what you've known." Margaret voiced the question they were all considering. What are these communities like? The people, the social environment, the opportunities for normal social relationships. Sterling's expression softened as he recognized her underlying concerns about marriage prospects and feminine companionship in frontier territories. The Gallatin Valley supports several thriving towns with established churches, social organizations, and cultural activities. Our ranch operations interact regularly with families throughout the region, creating social networks that include many educated, refined individuals who've chosen frontier life for its opportunities rather than its isolation. He paused, studying their faces as he addressed what he clearly recognized as their primary concern. As for marriage prospects, I should mention that frontier communities include many successful, educated men who would regard accomplished, independent women as ideal companions rather than subordinate servants. Your professional positions would establish you as valuable community members whose friendship and respect would be actively sought. Rebecca realized Sterling was describing a social environment completely different from their expectations about frontier territories. Rather than crude mining camps or isolated ranches, he was offering access to established communities where educated women could build meaningful social relationships while maintaining professional independence. The decision doesn't need to be made immediately, Sterling continued, though his tone suggested awareness that time was limited. However, resolving your father's debt situation will require prompt action. The creditors expect resolution by Saturday, which means arrangements must be finalized by Friday evening. 2 days. Rebecca felt the familiar pressure of impossible deadlines as she realized they would need to make life-altering decisions with minimal time for reflection or consultation. But the alternative, subjecting her sisters to auction and uncertain fates with unknown purchasers, made Sterling's offer seem not just attractive, but providential. "Mr. Sterling," she said carefully, "your proposal sounds too generous to be purely business-motivated. What aren't you telling us about your personal interest in this situation?" Sterling was quiet for several moments, his grey eyes distant as he considered how much truth to reveal. When he finally spoke, his voice carried personal conviction that transcended mere commercial considerations. "Miss Thompson, I've spent years building success in territories where strength and determination matter more than family connections or inherited advantages. But I've also watched good people destroyed by circumstances beyond their control, while predators prospered by exploiting others' misfortunes." His expression hardened as he continued. "What your creditors are proposing represents everything I despise about certain aspects of frontier justice. When I have the resources and influence to prevent such injustices, failing to act makes me complicit in the outcome." The simple declaration revealed Sterling as a man whose success hadn't diminished his concern for basic human dignity. Rebecca found herself studying his face more closely, recognizing something she had almost forgotten existed: genuine integrity combined with the power to act on moral convictions. "There's also a practical consideration," Sterling added with a slight smile. "Establishing my operations as the kind of place that attracts and retains quality personnel requires demonstrating that I value employees as individuals rather than just labor units. Word travels fast in frontier communities. How I handle this situation will influence my ability to recruit skilled people for years to come." The explanation satisfied Rebecca's skepticism while confirming her growing impression that Jackson Sterling was unlike any businessman she had ever encountered. His motivations combined personal ethics, practical considerations, and strategic thinking in ways that served everyone's interests while maintaining moral integrity. As afternoon shadows lengthened across their worn homestead, Rebecca realized they were facing the most important decision of their lives. Sterling's offer represented rescue from immediate catastrophe, but also commitment to unknown challenges in unfamiliar territory. The safety and familiarity of Missouri would be exchanged for opportunities and risks that none of them could fully anticipate. But the alternative was no longer just poverty and social disgrace. Saturday morning would bring public auction, permanent separation, and fates determined by whoever bid highest for their marriage contracts. Between certain catastrophes and uncertain opportunity, the choice seemed clear, even if the consequences remained unpredictable. The evening air carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke as Rebecca walked the familiar paths of their property, her mind wrestling with decisions that would reshape 4 lives forever. Sterling had departed with promises to return at dawn for their answer, his massive sorrel stallion disappearing into the twilight like something from a fever dream. The silence left behind felt heavier than the oppressive weight of their debts, charged with possibilities that seemed too extraordinary to trust. Margaret found her by the old oak tree where their mother used to read stories during summer afternoons, its gnarled branches now bare against the darkening sky. "Rebecca, are we really considering this? Leaving everything we've ever known to work for a stranger in Montana territory? What choice do we have?" Rebecca replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Something about Sterling's offer nagged at her, a perfection that seemed designed to address their exact needs with suspicious precision. Saturday morning, we become property sold to the highest bidders. At least Sterling offers employment contracts and personal autonomy. Sarah approached through the gathering dusk, her dark hair catching the last rays of sunlight. "I've been thinking about his newspaper proposal. Do you realize what that could mean? A woman publisher on the frontier with actual influence over territorial development and political discourse?" Her excitement was tempered by uncertainty. But why would a cattle rancher need his own newspaper? What business interest require that level of public communication? Catherine emerged from the house carrying oil lamps, her practical nature evident in her preparation for their family conference. "That's exactly what's been troubling me. Sterling's operations sound more like a territorial government than a ranch. 40,000 acres, multiple industries across 3 territories, transportation networks that represents political and economic influence on a scale that transcends simple cattle raising." Rebecca accepted a lamp from her youngest sister, noting how Catherine's sharp intelligence had identified the same inconsistencies that were causing her own unease. "What are you suggesting? That he's not what he claims to be?" "I'm suggesting that men with his level of wealth and influence don't rescue random families from debt crises unless those families serve purposes beyond simple employment needs." Catherine settled onto the wooden bench their father had built around the oak's massive trunk. "We need to understand his real motivations before committing to 5-year contracts in territories where we'd have no legal recourse if the situation proves uncomfortable." Margaret shivered in the cooling air, pulling her shawl closer. "But what alternatives do we have? Even if Sterling has hidden motives, surely employment with a wealthy rancher offers better prospects than auction to unknown purchasers." "Does it?" Sarah asked quietly. "At least auction purchasers would be operating under public scrutiny and legal oversight. Sterling's operations are hundreds of miles from any territorial authority, in regions where his word would be essentially law." The uncomfortable truth settled over them like the evening chill. Their desperation had made Sterling's offer seem providential, but careful consideration revealed troubling questions about a proposal that addressed their needs with almost supernatural precision. Rebecca rose and began pacing, her analytical mind working through the implications. "Let's examine what we actually know about Jackson Sterling versus what he's told us. He appeared within hours of the creditor's ultimatum, almost as if he'd been expecting this crisis. His knowledge of our situation was remarkably detailed for someone who claimed to learn about it this morning, and his immediate willingness to spend $15,000 on strangers suggests motivations beyond standard business recruitment. There's something else." Catherine added reluctantly. While he was talking to father, I noticed his saddlebags bore territorial government markings, faded, but visible if you knew what to look for. Government officials don't usually engage in private cattle ranching as their primary occupation. The observation struck Rebecca like a physical blow. Government connections could explain Sterling's wealth, influence, and detailed knowledge of their situation, but they also suggested complications that simple employment contracts wouldn't address. Territorial officials often pursued agendas that served federal interests rather than individual welfare. "What if he's not trying to rescue us?" Margaret whispered, voicing the fear that was growing in all their minds. "What if we're being recruited for something entirely different from what he described?" Sarah's artistic imagination began constructing scenarios that transformed rescue into entrapment. A man with his resources could establish isolated operations, where employees become dependent on his protection and support, with no realistic options for leaving or seeking help from outside authorities. The possibilities they were discussing painted Sterling's generous offer in increasingly sinister tones. Rather than salvation from their desperate circumstances, his proposal might represent a different form of bondage, one disguised as opportunity, but ultimately serving purposes they couldn't anticipate or control. Rebecca forced herself to consider the practical realities of their situation with brutal honesty. Even if Sterling has ulterior motives, we still face the same fundamental choice: potential exploitation under unknown conditions, or certain exploitation under conditions we know will be degrading and dangerous. Unless we can find a third alternative, Catherine said quietly. Such as? Catherine rose and walked to the edge of their property, where fence lines marked the boundaries of land that would no longer belong to them after Saturday. What if we don't wait for Sterling's return? What if we leave tonight, before the auction, before any creditors or mysterious ranchers can determine our fates for us? The suggestion struck them all silent. Fleeing in the night would mean abandoning their father, their home, and any hope of resolving the debt crisis that had destroyed their family. But it would also mean maintaining control over their destinies rather than surrendering that control to men whose true motivations remained unclear. Where would we go? Margaret asked practically. 4 women traveling alone without resources. Or destinations would face dangers that might make Sterling's questionable offer seem appealing by comparison. St. Louis, Catherine replied without hesitation. It's large enough to provide employment opportunities and anonymity. Sarah's writing skills, Margaret's education, your administrative abilities, my business sense. We could establish independent lives rather than accepting dependence on male protection. Rebecca felt her heart racing as she considered the audacious proposal. Cities like St. Louis did offer opportunities for self-sufficient women, particularly those with education and skills. Seamstresses, teachers, clerks, even shop owners. Urban environments provided options that rural communities couldn't match. The risks would be enormous, she said, though her tone suggested growing interest rather than dismissal. No money, no contacts, no guarantees of employment or housing. We could end up in situations far worse than anything Sterling might have planned. But they would be situations we chose, Sarah pointed out. Risks we accepted voluntarily, rather than circumstances, imposed by men whose true intentions remain hidden. The distinction resonated with Rebecca's growing conviction that maintaining autonomy over their decisions mattered more than the security of guaranteed outcomes. Sterling's offer, however generous it appeared, still represented surrender of self-determination to male authority. Flight to St. Louis would preserve their ability to make choices about their own lives, even if those choices involved substantial hardships and uncertain prospects. We'd need to leave, Father, Margaret said softly, the most painful aspect of the plan becoming clear Rebecca felt tears threatening as she contemplated abandoning the broken man who had once been their family's strength and protector. Thomas Thompson's failures had created their current crisis, but deserting him to face the consequences alone violated every principle of family loyalty she had been raised to respect. "Father made choices that led to this situation," Catherine said with the harsh pragmatism that characterized her thinking. "We can't sacrifice our futures to protect him from consequences he generated through his own decisions." That's an incredibly cold assessment of a man who's struggling with circumstances beyond his control, Margaret protested. "Circumstances he created through poor judgment and refusal to face reality," Catherine countered. "The farm has been failing for 3 years. Father chose to borrow money rather than sell property, chose to plant crops that had failed previously, chose to ignore mounting debts until they became impossible to manage. We've supported his decisions and suffered the consequences, but continuing to sacrifice ourselves for his mistakes serves no one's interests." The brutal analysis cut deep, but Rebecca recognized its accuracy. Their father's pride had prevented him from making difficult decisions that might have preserved their family's independence. Now that pride was about to cost his daughters their freedom, either through auction to unknown purchasers or dependence on a rancher whose true motivations remained mysterious. As they debated their impossible choices, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their family conference. Rebecca felt her stomach clench, expecting to see Sterling returning with additional pressure or demands. Instead, a different rider appeared, Sheriff William Hayes, whose presence at their property after dark suggested urgent official business. Hayes was a competent lawman who had served Cedar County faithfully for over a decade. His reputation, built on fairness rather than harsh enforcement of legal technicalities. His expression as he dismounted suggested discomfort with whatever mission had brought him to their door. "Evening, Miss Thompson," he said, touching his hat brim respectfully. "I apologize for the late hour, but I've received some information that concerns your family's situation." Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. Official involvement at this stage could only complicate their already desperate circumstances. "What kind of information, Sheriff Hayes?" "Information about Jackson Sterling and his business operations." Hayes's tone carried the gravity of a man delivering news he wished he didn't have to share. "I sent telegrams to territorial authorities in Montana and Colorado, asking about his background and reputation." The sisters exchanged glances that confirmed their growing suspicions about Sterling's true nature. If law enforcement was investigating his credentials, their instincts about hidden motivations had been correct. "What did you learn?" Catherine asked with characteristic directness. Hayes consulted a folded telegram he withdrew from his shirt pocket. "Jackson Sterling does indeed own extensive ranch operations in Montana Territory. His holdings and business interests match everything he told you. He's considered one of the most successful and influential businessmen in the region." Rebecca felt confusion replacing her suspicions. If Sterling's claims about his wealth and operations were accurate, what had prompted the sheriff's investigation? "However," Hayes continued, his tone growing more serious, "there are aspects of his background that raise significant concerns about his current activities." "What kind of concerns?" Margaret asked, though her expression suggested she dreaded the answer. "Sterling isn't just a successful rancher. He's also a federal agent working under the direct authority of the United States Marshal Service with special jurisdiction over territorial development and criminal investigations." Hayes studied their faces as the implications sank in. His presence here, his detailed knowledge of your situation, his extraordinary offer, none of this is coincidental. You're being recruited for federal operations that could involve considerable personal danger. The revelation struck Rebecca like a physical blow. Sterling's government connections explained his wealth, influence, and suspicious timing, but they also meant his offer involved obligations and risks far beyond simple employment. Federal agents didn't recruit civilian women for routine administrative work. "What kind of federal operations?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hayes folded the telegram carefully before responding. "The territories are experiencing unprecedented criminal activity, cattle rustling, mining claim disputes, railroad fraud, territorial government corruption. Sterling's operations serve as cover for investigations that require personnel who can move freely through frontier communities without attracting attention. You're saying he wants to use us as spies?" Margaret's refined sensibilities were clearly horrified by the suggestion. "I'm saying his employment offers probably involve activities that legitimate ranch operations wouldn't require, and that the risks you'd face would extend far beyond anything he's described." Hayes's expression showed genuine concern for their welfare. "Federal agents in the territories have been killed, disappeared, or suffered fates that the government prefers not to discuss publicly." Catherine's analytical mind immediately grasped the fuller implications. If Sterling is operating under federal authority, then our debt crisis, the creditors' ultimatum, even the proposed auction, all of this could be manufactured to create circumstances that would make his offer seem irresistible. The suggestion that their entire crisis might be orchestrated struck Rebecca as too elaborate to be credible, but she couldn't dismiss the possibility entirely. Government agents did create situations that served their recruitment needs, particularly when they required personnel with specific qualifications for dangerous assignments. "What proof do we have that any of this is real?" she asked Sheriff Hayes. "How do we know you're not part of whatever Sterling has planned?" Hayes smiled grimly at her suspicion. "Miss Thompson, if I were part of a federal recruitment operation, I'd be encouraging you to accept Sterling's offer rather than warning you about its potential dangers." He paused, studying their faces in the lamplight. "The truth is, I've known your family for years, and I couldn't stand by while you made decisions based on incomplete information." Rebecca felt torn between gratitude for the sheriff's warning and growing despair about their impossible situation. If Sterling represented federal authority with hidden agendas, their choices had been reduced from difficult to virtually non-existent. They could submit to auction and certain exploitation, accept Sterling's offer and possible federal manipulation, or flee into uncertainty with no resources and limited prospects for survival. "Sheriff Hayes," she said finally, "if you were in our position, what would you do?" The lawman was quiet for several moments, clearly weighing his responsibilities as an officer against his concern for their welfare. "Miss Thompson, I'd probably take Sterling's offer and hope that federal authority provides better protection than private exploitation, but I'd also demand complete honesty about what's expected and what risks are involved." As Sheriff Hayes departed, leaving them with information that complicated their decision beyond any reasonable resolution, Rebecca realized they had moved far beyond simple choices between security and freedom. They were now navigating between different forms of service to male authority, each carrying risks and obligations that could reshape their lives in ways they couldn't predict or control. The oak tree that had sheltered their mother's stories now cast shadows that seemed to reach toward an uncertain future, where four sisters would need to choose between known exploitation and unknown service to forces larger than their individual destinies. Dawn came gray and cold to the Thompson homestead, painting the familiar landscape in shades that matched Rebecca's mood as she watched Jackson Sterling ride up their lane precisely at sunrise. His punctuality suggested military discipline rather than casual business courtesy, reinforcing Sheriff Hayes' revelations about federal connections and hidden agendas. The man who had seemed like providential rescue the previous day now appeared as something far more complex and potentially dangerous. Sterling dismounted with the same fluid grace that had initially impressed Rebecca, but this morning she noticed details that had escaped her attention during yesterday's desperate hope for salvation. His boots showed wear patterns consistent with extended travel rather than ranch work. His gun belt positioned the holster for quick draw rather than practical utility. Most tellingly, his grey eyes swept their property with systematic thoroughness that spoke of professional assessment rather than casual observation. "Miss Thompson," he said, touching his hat brim with the same courteous gesture, though Rebecca now detected calculation behind the courtesy. "I trust you've had adequate time to consider my proposal." Rebecca stepped onto the porch with her three sisters flanking her in a formation that projected unity despite their internal conflicts. They had argued through most of the night about how to handle this confrontation, ultimately agreeing on a strategy of direct challenge rather than deceptive acceptance or outright refusal. "Mr. Sterling," Rebecca replied, her voice carrying none of yesterday's desperate gratitude, "we've indeed considered your proposal very carefully. We've also received some additional information about your background that raises questions about the true nature of your offer." Sterling's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle tension that confirmed Rebecca's growing conviction that they were dealing with a man accustomed to danger and deception. "What kind of additional information?" "Miss Thompson," Catherine stepped forward with the directness that characterized her approach to complex problems. "Information indicating that Jackson Sterling is not simply a successful rancher, but also a federal agent operating under U.S. martial authority with special jurisdiction over territorial investigations." The accusation hung in the morning air like gunsmoke. Sterling remained motionless for several heartbeats, his grey eyes studying each sister's face as he apparently calculated how much truth the situation required. When he finally spoke, his voice carried acknowledgement rather than denial. "Sheriff, Hayes has been busy," Sterling said with what might have been admiration. "I underestimated his investigative capabilities and his concern for your family's welfare." Margaret gasped at his implicit confirmation of their suspicions, while Sarah's face flushed with indignation at the deception they had nearly accepted. Rebecca felt a complex mixture of vindication and renewed despair as she realized their instincts about hidden motives had been accurate. "So you admit that everything you told us yesterday was carefully constructed lies designed to manipulate us into accepting recruitment for federal operations we knew nothing about?" Rebecca's voice sharpened with controlled anger. "Not lies," Sterling corrected with unexpected gentleness. "Incomplete truths presented in a context designed to serve everyone's interests while addressing immediate crisis. My ranch operations are exactly as I described them. The employment opportunities are legitimate and the compensation accurate. The only deception involved the additional responsibilities that federal service would occasionally require." Catherine's analytical mind immediately identified the crucial flaw in his explanation. Occasional additional responsibilities involving activities dangerous enough that federal agents are regularly killed or disappeared in the territories. That's not a minor omission, Mr. Sterling. That's deliberate concealment of life-threatening risks. Sterling studied Catherine with what appeared to be professional respect. "Miss Catherine, you possess exactly the kind of analytical intelligence that makes you valuable for the work I'm actually proposing. Yes, federal investigations in the territories involve substantial risks, but they also offer opportunities to influence territorial development in ways that could benefit thousands of people while establishing your own positions of genuine authority and influence." Sarah stepped forward, her artistic temperament inflamed by what she perceived as intellectual manipulation. You're asking us to risk our lives for federal policies we had no voice in creating, to serve government interests that may conflict with our personal values, all while pretending we're simply ranch employees. That's not opportunity, Mr. Sterling. That's exploitation disguised as patriotic service. Miss Sarah, federal service does indeed require subordinating personal interests to larger objectives, Sterling acknowledged. But consider the alternative. Tomorrow, morning's auction, where you'll become property of men whose objectives may prove considerably less honorable than federal law enforcement. The brutal reminder struck home, forcing Rebecca to confront the uncomfortable reality that righteous indignation couldn't resolve their fundamental crisis. Whether Sterling represented deceptive recruitment or genuine rescue, Saturday's auction remained their fate unless some alternative materialized. Mr. Sterling, Rebecca said carefully, assuming we were willing to consider federal service, and I'm not saying we are, what exactly would these occasional additional responsibilities involve? What specific dangers would we face, and what legal protections would we have if situations became uncomfortable? Sterling's expression grew more serious as he apparently decided that complete honesty offered better prospects than continued partial disclosure. The territories are experiencing unprecedented criminal activity that threatens federal authority and territorial development. Cattle rustling operations spanning multiple territories, mining claim frauds involving millions of dollars, railroad, construction corruption, and territorial government officials accepting bribes to ignore federal regulations. He paused, studying their faces as he outlined the scope of criminal enterprise his operations were designed to address. Traditional law enforcement methods are inadequate because the criminals have established networks that include local sheriffs, territorial judges, and business leaders. Federal agents operating openly are quickly identified and eliminated or compromised. Margaret asked the question they were all considering. And you believe 4 women from Missouri could succeed where trained federal agents have failed? I believe 4 intelligent, educated women could move through frontier communities without attracting the suspicion that male federal agents inevitably generate, Sterling replied. Ranch employees, teachers, bookkeepers, newspaper correspondents, these are roles that would provide perfect cover for gathering information and establishing communication networks. Catherine's sharp intelligence immediately grasped the broader implications. You're proposing to use us as undercover agents in an intelligence operation designed to identify and expose criminal networks throughout the territories. That's exactly what I'm proposing, Sterling confirmed, without attempting to soften the reality. Dangerous work that requires intelligence, courage, and the ability to maintain false identities under potentially life-threatening circumstances. The stark honesty was both refreshing and terrifying. Rebecca found herself appreciating Sterling's willingness to reveal the true nature of what he was offering, while simultaneously recognizing that accepting such work could result in their deaths if they proved inadequate to the challenges involved. What training would we receive? Sarah asked, her practical nature asserting itself despite her moral objections to deceptive federal service. 6 months of intensive preparation at a secure facility in Colorado Territory. Firearms training, surveillance techniques, communication methods, legal procedures, territorial law, criminal investigation, and personal protection. Sterling's outline suggested preparation more comprehensive than many legitimate careers required. Upon completion, you'd be sworn federal agents with authority to carry weapons, make arrests, and request military support when necessary. The scope of authority he was describing transcended anything Rebecca had imagined possible for women in 19th century America. Federal agent status would provide legal protections and official recognition that few women ever achieved, along with opportunities to influence territorial development on a regional scale. "And if we refuse?" Margaret asked quietly. Sterling's expression showed genuine regret as he answered, "Then you face tomorrow's auction with my profound apologies for involving you in federal business without adequate explanation from the beginning." Thompson appeared in the doorway, his haggard appearance showing the effects of sleepless guilt and approaching disgrace. "Mr. Sterling, are you withdrawing your offer to purchase my debts?" "Not withdrawing, Mr. Thompson. Clarifying the true nature of what acceptance would involve for your daughters." Sterling's tone toward the broken farmer carried compassion rather than contempt. "They deserve to make informed decisions about risking their lives for federal service, rather than accepting deception disguised as generosity." Rebecca felt torn between appreciation for Sterling's belated honesty and anger at the manipulation that had brought them to this point. "Mr. Sterling, yesterday you presented yourself as providential rescue from impossible circumstances. Today, we discover your federal recruitment offering different but equally dangerous forms of service. How do we know this conversation represents complete truth rather than another layer of deception?" Sterling reached into his coat and withdrew a leather credential case, handing it to Rebecca for examination. "Special Agent Jackson Sterling, United States Marshal Service, Territorial Investigations Division. Authorized to recruit civilian personnel for undercover operations under the Federal Agent Assistance Act of 1885. The official documents appeared authentic, complete with federal seals and authorizations that confirmed everything he had revealed. Rebecca found herself holding proof that their desperate situation had attracted attention from the highest levels of federal law enforcement. "The choice is yours," Sterling continued. "Federal service with complete knowledge of risks and responsibilities, or civilian auction with whatever consequences that might involve. But the choice must be made now, because tomorrow morning will be too late for any alternative." Catherine voiced the question that crystallized their impossible decision. "If we accept federal service, what guarantee do we have that we'll survive long enough to benefit from the authority and influence you're describing?" Sterling's honesty remained brutal. "No guarantees beyond the training, equipment, and support that federal resources can provide. Some agents succeed and build influential careers. Others die serving federal objectives they believed were worth the sacrifice. The only certainty is that doing nothing guarantees defeat by circumstances you had no voice in creating." Rebecca realized they had reached the moment of truth that would determine their futures. Accept Sterling's federal recruitment and risk death-serving government objectives they barely understood. Submit to tomorrow's auction and risk exploitation by men whose intentions were completely unknown. Flee to uncertain urban anonymity with no resources and limited prospects for survival. None of the options offered security or guaranteed positive outcomes. All involved surrendering aspects of their autonomy to forces beyond their control. The only variables were the nature of the risks they would accept and the degree of authority they might eventually achieve. "Mr. Sterling," Rebecca said finally, "if we accept your offer, we do so as equal partners in whatever operations you're planning, not as subordinate employees following orders we don't understand. We participate in strategic planning, we have voice in operational decisions, and we maintain the right to withdraw if circumstances become unacceptable." Sterling smiled for the first time since revealing his true identity. "Miss Thompson, Federal. Agents who can't think independently and make strategic decisions under pressure don't survive long enough to build successful careers. What you're demanding is exactly what effective undercover work requires." Margaret found her voice, despite her obvious fear. "And our father? What happens to him if we accept federal service? Your father's debts would be resolved as promised, and he would receive a position managing agricultural operations at one of our Colorado facilities. Protected, comfortable, and close enough for regular contact. Sterling's provisions extended beyond their immediate family to include consideration for the man whose failures had created their crisis. Federal operations take care of their personnel's families. The comprehensive nature of Sterling's arrangements suggested long-term planning that encompassed every aspect of their situation. Rebecca began to suspect that federal interest in their family extended beyond simple recruitment convenience to include specific reasons why 4 educated sisters from Missouri might serve federal objectives better than alternative personnel. "Mr. Sterling," she said, voicing her growing suspicion, "there's something you're still not telling us. Why us specifically? What makes 4 farmers' daughters more valuable for federal operations than trained agents or recruited professionals?" Sterling's expression grew thoughtful as he considered how much additional truth the situation required. "Miss Thompson, you've identified the final piece of information that complete honesty demands. Your family wasn't selected randomly. You were specifically identified because your particular combination of skills, background, and circumstances makes you ideally suited for a specific operation that other personnel couldn't accomplish. The revelation that they had been targeted rather than accidentally discovered added another layer of complexity to their already impossible decision. Rebecca felt the last vestiges of coincidence and chance dissolving as she realized their entire crisis might have been orchestrated to create circumstances that would make federal recruitment irresistible. "What specific operation?" Catherine demanded with characteristic directness. Sterling glanced toward the horizon, where dust clouds suggested approaching riders, his expression growing urgent. "An operation that we need to discuss immediately, because it appears our time for private conversation is about to end." The approaching dust cloud resolved into 3 riders, moving at the urgent pace of men carrying important news or pursuing specific objectives. Sterling's hand moved instinctively toward his holstered weapon, his professional instincts apparently triggered by something in the rider's formation or approach. Rebecca felt tension crackling in the morning air as she realized their private confrontation was about to become complicated by unknown factors. The lead rider emerged from the dust as a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 30s, wearing the kind of expensive clothing that marked successful business operations, combined with the practical modifications that suggested extensive frontier experience. His companions flanked him with military precision, their positions and alertness indicating professional security rather than casual travel companions. "Sterling," the man called out, as he reined in his mount 20 yards from the Thompson porch. His voice carried authority and familiarity that suggested previous encounters between the 2 men. "I understand you've been conducting recruitment activities in this area without proper coordination with existing operations." Rebecca noticed Sterling's jaw tighten as he recognized implications in the stranger's words that weren't immediately obvious to civilian observers. "Caldwell, I wasn't expecting Denver office involvement in territorial recruitment decisions." The exchange of names provided context that made Rebecca's pulse quicken. If Sterling represented one federal operation while this Caldwell character represented another, their family crisis had attracted attention from multiple government agencies, with potentially conflicting objectives. Caldwell dismounted with the fluid efficiency of a career military officer, his grey eyes sweeping over the 4 sisters with professional assessment that made Rebecca feel like livestock being evaluated for purchase. "Agent Sterling, you're operating outside your designated jurisdiction and recruiting personnel already identified for alternative federal service." "Alternative federal service?" Catherine stepped forward with characteristic directness, her analytical mind immediately grasping that they had become the subject of competing government interests. Mr. Caldwell, are you suggesting that multiple federal agencies have been monitoring our family situation? Caldwell's expression showed surprise at being addressed directly by one of the women he had apparently come to claim. His response carried the condescending tone of a man unaccustomed to explaining government policies to civilian females. Miss Thompson, federal resource allocation requires coordination between agencies to avoid duplication of effort and ensure optimal personnel utilization. Sarah's artistic temperament flared at his bureaucratic language. In plain English, Mr. Caldwell, you're saying that government agencies have been competing over who gets to exploit our desperate situation for their own purposes. I'm saying that your particular combination of skills and circumstances has been identified as valuable for operations that extend beyond Agent Sterling's territorial investigations. Caldwell's tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to compliance rather than questioning. The Department of Interior has requirements for personnel capable of conducting mineral surveys and territorial mapping in regions where male agents would attract unwanted attention. Sterling's expression darkened as the competing federal interest became clear. Caldwell, these women haven't agreed to any federal service yet. Your Denver office has no authority to reassign personnel who haven't been officially recruited. They have no authority to decline federal service when national security interests are involved. Caldwell countered with bureaucratic certainty. The Mineral Survey Act of 1886 provides specific authorization for civilian recruitment when territorial development requires specialized personnel. Rebecca felt the conversation spinning beyond their control as federal agencies argued over rights to their services without acknowledging their autonomy as free citizens capable of making independent decisions. The auction that had seemed like their worst possible fate was beginning to appear almost preferable to becoming property disputed between competing government operations. Gentlemen, she said with enough authority to interrupt their jurisdictional argument, perhaps you could explain what these competing federal operations actually involve before continuing your debate over who has prior claims to our services. Caldwell turned toward her with obvious reluctance to discuss operational details with civilian personnel, but apparently recognizing that some explanation was necessary to secure cooperation. Miss Thompson, the territories contain vast mineral resources, gold, silver, copper, coal deposits that could fuel American industrial expansion for generations. Accurate survey and mapping of these resources requires personnel who can operate in remote areas without attracting attention from claim jumpers, foreign agents, or hostile indigenous populations. Margaret found her voice despite her obvious discomfort with the increasingly complex federal involvement. And you believe 4 women from Missouri possess qualifications for geological surveying that trained professionals lack? We believe 4 educated women with appropriate training could conduct surveys while maintaining cover identities as teachers, missionaries, or homestead families that would allow access to restricted areas. Caldwell's explanation revealed operations considerably different from Sterling's law enforcement recruitment. Territorial mapping operations require long-term assignments in isolated regions where traditional surveying crews would be attacked or expelled. Catherine's analytical intelligence immediately identified the critical distinction between the competing federal offers. Mr. Sterling's proposal involves criminal investigation activities based from established ranch operations with regular contact and support. Mr. Caldwell's proposal involves extended isolation in potentially hostile territory, conducting geological surveys for mineral extraction purposes. Both operations involve substantial personal risk, Sterling added grimly. But mineral surveying in disputed territories presents dangers that law enforcement work doesn't typically encounter. Claim jumper violence, foreign espionage interests, indigenous territorial conflicts, and complete isolation from federal support during extended field assignments. Rebecca felt overwhelming frustration as she realized their options had expanded from difficult to impossible. 3 federal agencies apparently wanted their services for different operations, each involving life-threatening risks for objectives they had no voice in establishing. Meanwhile, Saturday morning's auction approached with mathematical certainty, unless some resolution materialized. "Mr. Caldwell," she said carefully, "what legal authority compels us to accept federal service of any kind? What prevents us from declining both operations and facing whatever civilian consequences our situation involves?" Caldwell's expression grew stern as he apparently decided that complete honesty was required to secure compliance. "Miss Thompson, your father's debt crisis has attracted federal attention because several of his creditors are suspected of operating fraudulent lending, schemes that target struggling farmers throughout the region. Your family's situation is evidence in an ongoing federal investigation. The revelation struck like a physical blow." Rebecca felt the last vestiges of coincidence dissolving as she realized their personal crisis was connected to criminal enterprises that had already attracted federal law enforcement attention. "You're saying our debts are evidence of crimes committed against us?" Sarah asked with growing indignation. "I'm saying your father may have been deliberately targeted by predatory lenders working in coordination with land speculators who profit from foreclosure sales of prime agricultural property." Caldwell's explanation reframed their crisis from personal failure to criminal victimization. Federal investigations require witness cooperation to prosecute such schemes successfully. Thomas Thompson emerged fully from the house, his broken appearance contrasting sharply with the federal agent's professional authority. "Are you telling me that the men who loaned me money were deliberately trying to destroy my farm?" "Mr. Thompson, preliminary investigation suggests your creditors have repeated similar patterns with dozens of Missouri farmers, offering loans with impossible terms, manipulating market conditions to ensure crop failures, then acquiring property through foreclosure at below-market prices." Caldwell's outline described systematic criminal enterprise rather than individual business misfortune. "Your cooperation could help prosecute criminals who have defrauded hundreds of farming families." Rebecca felt her worldview shifting as personal shame transformed into righteous anger. If their father had been targeted by criminal conspirators, their family's suffering represented victimization rather than failure. The social condemnation they had endured from neighbors and creditors was based on deliberate deception rather than legitimate business obligations. "What kind of cooperation?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would involve federal service regardless of which agency secured their recruitment. Sterling stepped forward, apparently recognizing opportunity to regain advantage in the federal recruitment competition. Testifying against the criminal conspiracy would require witness protection and relocation to territories where the defendant's associates couldn't retaliate. Ranch operations in Montana could provide perfect cover for protected witnesses while they prepare for trial testimony. Mineral surveying operations could provide even better protection, Caldwell countered, along with opportunities to contribute to territorial development that would benefit the entire nation rather than simply law enforcement objectives. Catherine's sharp intelligence cut through both federal offers to identify the underlying manipulation. "You're both using our victimization by criminal conspiracy to justify recruitment for operations that serve federal objectives rather than..." Our family's interests, whether we're witnesses, agents, or surveyors, we're still being conscripted for government service without genuine choice in the matter. The blunt assessment silenced both federal agents temporarily, as they apparently recognized how their competing offers appeared from the civilian perspective. Rebecca appreciated Catherine's ability to identify the essential reality beneath bureaucratic justifications and professional obligations. "Miss Catherine," Sterling said finally, "federal service does indeed involve subordinating personal interests to larger objectives, but consider the alternatives. Prosecution of the criminal conspiracy requires witness testimony regardless of your other choices. Refusing federal protection could expose your family to retaliation from defendants who have already demonstrated willingness to destroy people's lives for financial profit." Margaret voiced the question that crystallized their impossible situation. "Are you saying we have to choose between different forms of federal service or face criminal retaliation without government protection?" "I'm saying witness protection is necessary regardless of what additional federal service you might accept," Sterling replied honestly. "The criminal conspiracy your father's situation has exposed involves individuals with resources and connections throughout Missouri and neighboring states. Staying here as civilian witnesses would put your entire family at serious risk." Caldwell added his own pressure to the federal recruitment efforts. "Witness protection through mineral survey operations would provide better long-term security than law enforcement cover identities. Surveying crews operate in remote areas where criminal retaliation would be virtually impossible." Rebecca felt trapped by circumstances that seemed designed to eliminate every option except federal service in some form. Whether they became law enforcement agents, mineral surveyors, or simply protected witnesses, their autonomy as free citizens was being systematically destroyed by forces claiming to serve their protection and national interests. "There's one other consideration," Sterling said, his tone suggesting reluctance to introduce additional complications. "The auction scheduled for tomorrow morning may not proceed as your creditors planned." "What do you mean?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected any federal intervention in the auction would serve government objectives rather than their family's welfare. "Federal investigation of the criminal lending conspiracy requires preserving evidence, including the property and assets that demonstrate the defendant's fraudulent methods." Sterling's explanation suggested legal maneuvers that would prevent the auction without necessarily resolving their underlying situation. Court orders freezing the defendant's assets could suspend foreclosure proceedings indefinitely. Thompson's voice cracked with desperate hope. "Does that mean we could keep our farm?" Caldwell answered with bureaucratic precision that crushed any hope of simple resolution. "Asset freezes preserve evidence for prosecution purposes, Mr. Thompson. They don't restore ownership or resolve legitimate debt obligations. Your property would remain under federal control pending trial outcomes that could take years to resolve." The revelation that federal intervention offered legal limbo rather than actual resolution struck Rebecca as the final confirmation that government involvement served federal interests exclusively. Their family would become permanent wards of federal authority, dependent on government decisions about their housing, employment, and future prospects. "So our choices," she said, summarizing their impossible situation, "are federal service as law enforcement agents, federal service as mineral surveyors, or federal custody as protected witnesses indefinitely dependent on government support. Those appear to be the realistic options given your family's circumstances and the criminal investigation requirements," Sterling acknowledged, with what seemed like genuine regret about the limited alternatives available. Rebecca looked at her. Three sisters, seeing her own recognition of their trapped situation reflected in their faces. Margaret's refined dreams of respectable marriage and social position had been replaced by federal recruitment for dangerous service. Sarah's artistic ambitions were being redirected toward government communications needs. Catherine's analytical intelligence was being conscripted for territorial mapping rather than independent business development. Their father's failures had made them vulnerable to criminal exploitation, which had attracted federal attention that was transforming them into government assets, regardless of their personal preferences or life plans. The auction had been intended to convert them into property, while federal recruitment aimed to convert them into instruments of government policy. "Mr. Sterling, Mr. Caldwell," Rebecca said finally, "we need time to discuss these options privately before making decisions that will determine our futures." "Time is unfortunately limited," Caldwell replied, consulting his pocket watch with bureaucratic urgency. "Federal coordination requires decisions by noon today to prevent jurisdictional conflicts and ensure proper resource allocation." 3 hours. Rebecca felt the familiar pressure of impossible deadlines as she realized federal agencies operated with the same disregard for civilian decision-making time that private creditors had shown. Whether the coercion came from criminal conspirators or government agents, their autonomy was being systematically eliminated by forces that claimed authority over their lives and futures. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows that seemed to symbolize the diminishing time available for choices that would reshape 4 lives forever. In the distance, additional dust clouds suggested more riders approaching, raising the possibility that their already complex situation was about to become even more complicated by additional federal agencies or criminal interests seeking to influence their ultimate fate. The approaching dust clouds materialized into 2 separate groups of riders converging on the Thompson property from different directions, their coordinated timing suggesting planned rather than coincidental arrival. Rebecca felt her stomach clench as she recognized that their family crisis had escalated beyond federal recruitment competition into something resembling a territorial standoff involving multiple factions with conflicting interests. From the east came 4 men whose expensive clothing and quality horses marked them as successful businessmen, though their alert postures and obvious weapons suggested they were prepared for confrontation rather than negotiation. From the south appeared 3 riders whose rough appearance and predatory movements immediately triggered Rebecca's instincts about dangerous men accustomed to violence. Sterling's hand moved closer to his weapon as he studied the approaching groups. "Caldwell, did your Denver office coordinate with other agencies about this operation?" "Negative. This level of attention suggests security compromises or criminal surveillance that weren't anticipated in our intelligence assessments." Caldwell's professional concern was evident as he calculated tactical disadvantages of their exposed position. "We may need to evacuate these civilians immediately before this situation deteriorates further." Rebecca felt anger flaring at being discussed as cargo to be moved around by federal agents who had created this complicated situation through their competing recruitment efforts. "Mr. Sterling, Mr. Caldwell, perhaps you could explain who these people are before deciding what needs to happen to our family without our input." The Eastern group reached their property first, led by a well-dressed man in his 40s whose authoritative bearing suggested leadership position in whatever organization he represented. His companions spread out in formation that provided both security and intimidation, their movements indicating military or law enforcement training. "Agent Sterling," the man called out as he reined in his mount, "I'm Deputy Marshal Henderson from the Kansas City Federal Office. We've received reports about unauthorized recruitment activities that require immediate investigation." Sterling's expression showed recognition and what might have been professional respect. Henderson, I wasn't expecting Kansas City involvement in territorial operations. Territorial operations that cross state lines fall under our jurisdiction. When they involve civilian recruitment without proper authorization, Henderson replied, his tone carrying bureaucratic authority backed by federal law. These civilians are potential witnesses in cases being prosecuted by our office, which takes precedence over territorial agency recruitment efforts. Caldwell stepped forward, apparently determined to assert his own agency's claims. Deputy Marshal Henderson, these personnel were identified for mineral survey operations under Department of Interior authority. Your Kansas City office has no jurisdiction over territorial resource development programs. Rebecca watched the federal agents argue over jurisdictional authority, while armed men from multiple agencies surrounded their property, transforming their mourning into something resembling a siege conducted by competing government forces. The absurdity of their situation struck her as she realized they had become the subject of a bureaucratic turf war involving at least 3 federal agencies. The southern group of riders approached during this federal debate, their leader a lean, weathered man whose cold eyes and casual violence suggested criminal rather than government affiliation. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to intimidating others through implied threats. Gentlemen, you're trespassing on property. That's under private security contract pending resolution of financial obligations. His announcement challenged all federal authority while asserting alternative claims to the Thompson family situation. Mr. Morrison and his associates require these premises cleared of unauthorized personnel immediately. Sterling turned to face the new arrival, his professional assessment apparently recognizing significant threat potential. And you are? Marcus Webb, security contractor for Morrison Financial Services and associated creditor organizations. The man's introduction confirmed Rebecca's suspicions about criminal involvement in their debt crisis. These premises and occupants are under private protection pending legal proceedings scheduled for tomorrow morning. Catherine stepped forward with characteristic directness, her analytical mind cutting through the competing claims to identify crucial information. Mr. Webb, are you saying that our creditors have hired armed security to ensure the auction proceeds as scheduled, despite federal investigation of fraudulent lending practices? Webb's expression showed surprise at being challenged directly by one of the women he had apparently come to control, but he recovered quickly with the kind of condescending threat that bullies used against perceived weakness. Miss Thompson, legal proceedings authorized by territorial courts take precedence over federal investigations that haven't been properly coordinated with local authorities. Henderson's voice hardened as he recognized the implications of Webb's presence. Security contractor, are you interfering with federal witnesses in an ongoing criminal investigation? I'm protecting legitimate business interests from federal overreach that lacks proper legal authorization, Webb replied, his hand moving closer to his weapon. These people have financial obligations that require resolution regardless of what stories federal agents might tell about criminal conspiracies. Rebecca felt the tension escalating toward violence as armed representatives of federal agencies, criminal enterprises, and private security forces established opposing positions around their property. Her family had become the focal point for conflicts between law enforcement, territorial authority, and criminal interests that extended far beyond their individual circumstances. Sarah voiced the question that captured their increasingly desperate situation. Are we about to witness a gunfight between federal agents and criminal security forces on our front porch? Only if these criminals are stupid enough to draw weapons on federal officers, Sterling replied grimly, his tone suggesting professional eagerness for such confrontation. Webb, you and your associates have exactly 30 seconds to withdraw from federal jurisdiction before I arrest you for obstruction of justice. Webb's laugh held no humor, as he apparently decided that intimidation tactics were more effective than legal compliance. Agent Sterling, you're operating outside your territorial authority, with no backup support and no legal standing to make arrests in Missouri jurisdiction. I suggest you reconsider your threats. Margaret gasped as she realized they were witnessing the prelude to armed conflict between men whose competing interests had reduced their family to collateral damage in larger struggles for authority and control. Please, can't this be resolved without violence? Miss Thompson, Henderson said more gently, criminal organizations that profit from fraudulent lending schemes don't typically respond to peaceful resolution attempts. Sometimes federal law enforcement requires demonstration of force to protect civilian witnesses. Thomas Thompson emerged fully from the house, apparently driven by desperation to address the armed confrontation developing around his family. Gentlemen, surely some accommodation can be reached that doesn't involve gunfire on my property. Webb studied the broken farmer with obvious contempt. Mr. Thompson, you signed legal documents accepting financial obligations with specific terms and consequences. Federal agents telling stories about criminal conspiracies doesn't change your contractual commitments or legal responsibilities. Mr. Thompson signed documents that were deliberately designed to be impossible to fulfill, Caldwell interjected, his bureaucratic precision cutting through Webb's intimidation tactics. Federal investigation has identified systematic fraud involving dozens of Missouri farmers who were targeted by coordinated lending schemes. Webb's expression grew more dangerous as he recognized that federal agents possessed detailed knowledge about the criminal conspiracy he was apparently employed to protect. Federal agents making accusations about legitimate business practices without filing formal charges or presenting court orders are exceeding their legal authority. Sterling smiled grimly at Webb's implicit admission that criminal charges were a realistic possibility. Webb, formal charges and court orders are being prepared as we speak. Your employer's fraudulent lending operations have been under federal surveillance for months. This recruitment effort just accelerated our timeline for prosecution. The revelation that their family crisis had triggered the conclusion of extended federal investigation struck Rebecca as confirmation that nothing about their situation was coincidental or spontaneous. They had become instruments in planned law, enforcement operations designed to prosecute criminal enterprises that extended far beyond their individual circumstances. How long has our family been under federal surveillance? Catherine asked with the directness that characterized her approach to obtaining crucial information. Long enough to document the systematic targeting methods your creditors used against your father and dozens of other Missouri farmers, Henderson replied, apparently deciding that complete disclosure was necessary to secure witness cooperation. Your father's loans contained terms that were mathematically impossible to fulfill under normal agricultural conditions. Thomas Thompson's voice broke as he realized the scope of manipulation that had destroyed his family. Are you saying they never intended for me to repay the money? That they planned to foreclose from the beginning? We're saying your creditors operate a coordinated scheme to acquire prime agricultural property at below-market prices through deliberate foreclosure, Caldwell explained. Your farm's location and soil quality made it a specific target for acquisition regardless of your ability to manage debt obligations responsibly. The brutal explanation transformed their father's shame into justified anger as he understood that his family's suffering had been deliberately orchestrated by criminal conspirators. Rebecca felt her own rage building as she realized the social condemnation they had endured was based on lies designed to conceal systematic fraud. Webb apparently recognized that federal knowledge of the criminal conspiracy had eliminated opportunities for intimidation through legal technicalities. His hand moved toward his weapon with the unmistakable intent of someone preparing to use violence when other methods failed. "Webb," Sterling warned, his own weapon becoming visible though not yet drawn. "Drawing on federal officers is a capital offense that will end very badly for you and your associates. So is interfering with legitimate business operations through unauthorized federal overreach," Webb replied, though his voice carried less conviction than his previous threats. "My employers have invested considerable resources in acquiring these assets through proper legal channels." Henderson's patience apparently reached its limit as he decided that further negotiation served no useful purpose. "Mr. Webb, you have exactly 10 seconds to order your men to stand down and withdraw from this property, or you will all be arrested for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit fraud." Rebecca watched the tense standoff develop into the moment where violence or surrender would determine their family's immediate fate. Armed men representing federal law enforcement faced off against security contractors working for criminal organizations, while her sisters huddled on their front porch, waiting to discover whether they would become casualties in battles they had never chosen to join. The sound of additional approaching horses added new complexity to the already dangerous situation. From the west came a single rider moving at tremendous speed, his urgent pace suggesting either reinforcement for one faction or introduction of yet another competing interest in their family's fate. Sterling used his telescope to identify the approaching rider, his expression showing recognition and what appeared to be relief. "That's Agent Morrison from our Montana office. He's bringing the federal court orders we've been waiting for." Webb's confidence wavered as he realized federal agents had been coordinating legal maneuvers that would eliminate the jurisdictional advantages his criminal employers had been exploiting. Court orders don't change the fundamental business relationships that govern these proceedings. Federal court orders freezing assets obtained through fraudulent lending practices absolutely change business relationships, Henderson replied with bureaucratic satisfaction. "Your employer's entire operation is about to be suspended pending criminal prosecution." The approaching agent reached their property and dismounted while withdrawing official documents from his saddlebags. "Agent Sterling, Deputy Marshal Henderson, I have federal court orders suspending all foreclosure proceedings pending completion of criminal investigation into systematic lending fraud." Rebecca felt overwhelming relief as she realized the immediate threat of tomorrow's auction had been eliminated through federal intervention, though she understood that court orders created new forms of government control rather than restoring their family's independence. "Mr. Webb," the newly arrived agent announced formally, "you and your associates are hereby ordered to withdraw from these premises immediately. Any interference with federal investigation constitutes obstruction of justice punishable by imprisonment and substantial fines." Webb studied the court documents with obvious frustration, apparently recognizing that legal technicalities no longer supported his employer's claims to the Thompson property. "This federal overreach won't stand up to proper legal challenge. My employers have significant resources and political connections that will reverse these orders." "Your employer's political connections are currently being investigated for corruption and fraud conspiracy," Henderson replied cheerfully. "I suspect their influence will prove considerably less effective than they anticipated." The systematic destruction of criminal authority through federal legal action impressed Rebecca with the scope of planning that had preceded their family crisis. Law enforcement agencies had been gathering evidence and coordinating prosecution efforts while her family struggled with shame and despair about circumstances they couldn't control or understand. Webb recognized defeat and began gesturing for his men to withdraw, though his parting words carried implied threats about future retaliation. This isn't over. Federal protection doesn't last forever, and people who interfere with legitimate business interests sometimes face consequences that courts can't prevent. Sterling's response carried professional confidence, backed by federal authority. Webb, threatening federal witnesses is another felony charge we'll be happy to add to your employer's indictments. I suggest you focus on finding competent legal representation rather than making additional criminal threats. As the security contractors departed, leaving dust clouds and implied menace in their wake, Rebecca realized their immediate crisis had been resolved through federal intervention that created new dependencies and obligations. They were no longer facing auction or criminal retaliation, but they had become permanent wards of federal authority with limited autonomy over their future decisions. The competing federal agencies still required resolution of jurisdictional conflicts and recruitment decisions that would determine whether her family became law enforcement agents, mineral surveyors, or protected witnesses dependent on government support indefinitely. "Mr. Sterling, Mr. Caldwell, Deputy Marshal Henderson," Rebecca said, addressing all three federal representatives simultaneously. "Now that the immediate crisis has been resolved, perhaps you could explain what options remain for our families' future that don't involve permanent dependence on federal authority." The three federal agents exchanged glances that suggested Rebecca's question about alternatives to permanent federal dependency had touched on jurisdictional complexities they preferred not to discuss openly. Agent Morrison consulted additional documents from his saddlebags, while Sterling and Henderson appeared to calculate how much truth their situation required. "Miss Thompson," Henderson said finally, his tone carrying the careful precision of a man navigating legal technicalities. "Federal protection for witnesses in criminal conspiracy cases typically continues until prosecution is completed and retaliation threats are eliminated. In cases involving organized criminal enterprises, that protection can extend for years or become permanent if circumstances warrant." Catherine stepped forward, her analytical intelligence cutting directly to the implications Henderson was diplomatically avoiding. "You're saying that once we accept federal witness protection, we lose the legal right to withdraw from government control, even if we decide the arrangement is unsatisfactory. Federal witness protection operates under specific legal frameworks designed to ensure witness safety and testimony availability," Caldwell replied, with bureaucratic evasiveness that confirmed Catherine's suspicions. "Voluntary withdrawal from protection programs could compromise ongoing investigations and endanger both witnesses and law enforcement personnel." Rebecca felt the familiar sensation of walls closing around their choices as she realized federal rescue from criminal exploitation had transformed into a different form of permanent control. Whether they became property through auction or assets through federal protection, their autonomy as free citizens was being systematically eliminated by forces claiming to serve their welfare. Margaret voiced the question that crystallized their trapped situation. "Are you saying we have to choose between criminal retaliation and federal custody, with no option for genuine independence?" Sterling's expression showed what might have been genuine regret as he addressed the harsh realities of their circumstances. "Miss Margaret, the criminal conspiracy that targeted your family involves individuals with resources and connections throughout multiple states. Independence from federal protection would expose you to retaliation from people who have already demonstrated willingness to destroy families for financial profit. But federal protection involves obligations and restrictions that could prove equally limiting to our personal freedom," Sarah pointed out, her artistic temperament rebelling against the prospect of permanent government supervision. We know federal custody won't become another form of imprisonment disguised as protection." Agent Morrison withdrew additional documents that appeared to address the specific concerns the sisters were raising. Miss Thompson, federal witness protection can be structured to provide maximum personal autonomy consistent with security requirements. Location choices, career opportunities, social relationships, many aspects of protected status can be negotiated to serve witnesses' preferences while maintaining necessary safety measures. Rebecca studied Morrison's face, searching for deception or manipulation, but finding what appeared to be genuine concern for their welfare combined with practical understanding of legal limitations. Mr. Morrison, what specific autonomy would we retain under federal protection? What decisions would remain under our control versus federal authority? Morrison spread several documents across the porch railing, revealing legal frameworks more complex than simple custody arrangements. Protected witnesses retain authority over career choices, marriage decisions, property ownership, travel within approved territories, and social relationships subject to security clearance. Federal authority extends only to location security, identity protection, and coordination with ongoing investigations. Catherine examined the documents with characteristic thoroughness, her analytical mind assessing legal language that defined the boundaries of federal control. These protection agreements appear to preserve more individual autonomy than typical employment contracts. What's the practical reality versus the legal language? The practical reality depends largely on the specific threats involved and the cooperation level witnesses demonstrate, Henderson replied honestly. Witnesses who actively support federal investigations often receive maximum autonomy and resources. Those who resist cooperation or compromise security measures face increasing restrictions and limitations. Rebecca appreciated Henderson's straightforward explanation of how federal protection actually functioned, though she recognized the implicit threat that resistance to government objectives would result in punitive treatment disguised as security measures. And there's another consideration, Sterling added, apparently deciding that complete disclosure was necessary to secure informed cooperation. Federal protection for this case wouldn't necessarily be permanent. Successful prosecution of the criminal conspiracy could eliminate retaliation threats and allow transition to completely independent status with federal assistance for establishing new identities and careers. The possibility of eventual independence through federal cooperation offered hope that their current crisis might prove temporary rather than permanent. Though Rebecca understood that government promises about future autonomy carried no legal guarantees, Thomas Thompson found his voice despite the overwhelming complexity of federal arrangements being discussed around him. How long would this prosecution process require? How long would my daughters need federal protection? Criminal conspiracy cases involving multiple defendants and extensive evidence typically require 18 months to 3 years for complete prosecution, Morrison replied with bureaucratic precision. However, witness testimony often concludes much earlier in the process, potentially allowing transition to reduced protection status or complete independence. 3 years maximum, possibly much less. Rebecca felt cautious optimism as she realized federal protection might provide a bridge to genuine independence rather than permanent dependency. The alternative, immediate independence without protection, could result in criminal retaliation that would eliminate any possibility of future autonomy. Mr. Sterling, she said, addressing the agent whose recruitment offer had started their current crisis, if we accept federal witness protection, what happens to your original proposal about Montana ranch operations? Sterling smiled for the first time since the federal jurisdictional conflicts had begun. Miss Thompson, witness protection that utilizes ranch operations as cover provides both security and legitimate career opportunities. Your sisters could pursue the positions I originally described while contributing to federal investigations and enjoying government protection. And Mr. Caldwell's mineral survey operations? Sarah asked, apparently recognizing that multiple federal agencies might offer different career opportunities within the same protection framework. Mineral surveying could provide excellent cover for protected witnesses while serving federal resource development objectives, Caldwell confirmed. Extended assignments in remote territories would actually enhance security while providing valuable career experience and compensation. Catherine's analytical mind immediately identified the strategic opportunity their situation was creating. You're saying we could negotiate federal protection that combines multiple career opportunities, ranch operations, mineral surveying, law enforcement training, while maintaining witness status and government support. That's exactly what we're suggesting, Henderson confirmed. Federal protection for high-value witnesses often involves comprehensive career development designed to establish long-term security and independence while serving immediate investigation needs. Rebecca felt her perspective shifting as she realized federal recruitment was offering opportunities for professional development and personal growth that extended far beyond simple employment contracts. Rather than limiting their futures, government protection could provide resources and training that would establish them as influential figures in territorial development. Margaret stepped forward, her refined intelligence apparently recognizing possibilities that conventional marriage arrangements could never offer. What kind of social relationships would be permitted under federal protection? Marriage, courtship, community involvement. Protected witnesses are encouraged to establish normal social relationships that enhance their cover identities and community integration, Morrison replied. Marriage to approved individuals, participation in community organizations, business partnerships, most normal social activities are not only permitted but actively supported. Approved individuals, Catherine repeated with characteristic focus on crucial details. Who determines approval and what criteria are used for such decisions? Henderson's answer revealed practical flexibility within security requirements. Approval focuses on security clearance and background investigation rather than personal preferences or social status. Federal protection supports witnesses' relationship choices unless specific individuals pose identified security risks. The conversation was revealing federal protection as considerably more flexible and supportive than Rebecca had initially feared. Rather than imprisonment disguised as safety, government witness programs apparently offered resources and opportunities, while preserving most aspects of normal social life. There's one final consideration, Sterling said, his tone suggesting the most important information had been saved for last. Successful cooperation with federal investigations often results in substantial financial compensation beyond standard witness protection support. Criminal asset forfeiture and civil judgments against convicted defendants can provide significant monetary awards to witnesses whose testimony secures convictions. Financial compensation from successful prosecution could establish genuine long-term independence rather than temporary federal dependency. Rebecca felt excitement building as she realized their crisis might ultimately result in wealth and influence that exceeded anything their family could have achieved through traditional agriculture. What kind of financial compensation? Thompson asked, his voice carrying the first hope Rebecca had heard since their crisis began. Morrison consulted documents that outlined federal compensation policies for major criminal cases. Witness compensation in conspiracy cases typically ranges from 10 to 50% of recovered criminal assets, depending on the significance of testimony provided. Preliminary estimates suggest this case involves criminal profits exceeding $200,000. The figures struck Rebecca silent. 50% of $200,000 represented wealth that would establish her family among the most prosperous citizens in Missouri or any territory they chose for permanent residence. Federal witness protection could ultimately provide the financial independence that farming had never achieved. Catherine voiced the calculation they were all making. Maximum compensation would be $100,000, plus federal career development, plus professional training, plus security protection, plus eventual complete independence with new identities and government assistance for establishing businesses or careers. That's the potential outcome if your testimony contributes significantly to successful prosecution of the entire criminal conspiracy, Henderson confirmed. Federal investment in witness development often produces results that benefit both investigations and individual witnesses substantially. Rebecca looked at her three sisters, seeing her own amazement reflected in their faces as they absorbed the transformation of their circumstances from desperate crisis to unprecedented opportunity. Federal witness protection was offering resources and prospects that exceeded their most optimistic dreams about independent careers or successful marriages. "We need to discuss this privately," she announced, though her tone suggested decisions were already forming in her mind. Of course, Sterling agreed readily. However, federal coordination requires preliminary decisions by this afternoon to ensure proper resource allocation and security arrangements. Another federal deadline, though. This one offered opportunity rather than threatening disaster. Rebecca felt the familiar pressure of limited time for life-altering decisions, but recognized that accepting federal protection represented a calculated risk rather than desperate surrender to circumstances beyond their control. "Mr. Sterling, Mr. Caldwell, Deputy Marshal Henderson," she said formally, "please give us 1 hour to reach family consensus about federal witness protection and career opportunities within your various agencies." As the federal agents withdrew to provide privacy for their family conference, Rebecca realized they were facing the most important decision of their lives under circumstances none of them could have anticipated. Federal protection offered security, career development, and potential wealth, but required cooperation with government objectives and temporary surrender of complete autonomy. The alternative, rejecting federal protection and attempting to maintain independence, would expose them to criminal retaliation while providing no resources for establishing security or building careers in territories where women's opportunities were severely limited. "Sisters," Rebecca said quietly, "I believe we're about to become federal agents." The Thompson sisters stood in a circle beneath their mother's oak tree, the familiar shade providing sanctuary for the most important family conference of their lives. Rebecca studied each face, seeing her own mixture of apprehension and excitement, reflected in features that had grown harder and more determined through their ordeal. The frightened women who had awakened to creditor ultimatums 3 days earlier had been transformed into individuals capable of evaluating federal partnerships and negotiating their own destinies. "Before we make this decision," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the authority that had sustained them through impossible circumstances, "I want each of you to speak honestly about what accepting federal protection would mean for your personal dreams and ambitions." Margaret spoke first, her refined features animated by possibilities that conventional marriage could never have offered. "Rebecca, 3 days ago I thought my future involved accepting whatever husband would take a woman from a disgraced family. Now federal agents are offering career opportunities, financial independence, and the chance to establish schools throughout the territories." She paused, studying the homestead that had defined her entire world until this crisis. "I'd be foolish not to recognize this as the opportunity of several lifetimes." Sarah stepped forward, her artistic temperament clearly energized by the creative possibilities federal service could provide. The newspaper work, the territorial correspondence, the chance to document frontier development, these represent everything I've dreamed about, but never believed possible for a woman in our circumstances. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. Federal protection could give me a platform to influence territorial politics and social development that no private employment could match. Catherine's analytical assessment came with characteristic precision. From a purely strategic perspective, federal partnership offers optimal outcomes with manageable risks, career development, financial security, professional authority, and eventual complete independence, all while serving justice against the criminals who targeted our family. She smiled with genuine warmth. Besides, I've always wondered what I could accomplish with unlimited resources and government authority. Rebecca felt pride swelling in her chest as she recognized how their crisis had revealed strengths and capabilities that comfortable circumstances had never demanded. Her sisters weren't just accepting federal protection, they were embracing opportunities to become influential figures in territorial development while pursuing personal ambitions that conventional society would never have supported. "Father," Rebecca said, turning toward Thomas Thompson, who had remained silent throughout their family discussion, "this decision affects your future as well. What are your thoughts about federal witness protection and agricultural management in Colorado Territory?" Thomas Thompson's voice carried the first genuine hope Rebecca had heard since their crisis began. "Rebecca, 3 days ago I was a broken man who had destroyed his family through poor judgment and stubborn pride. These federal agents are offering me the chance to rebuild agricultural operations while contributing to something larger than personal failure." He paused, studying his daughters with expression that mixed paternal pride and amazement. "More importantly, they're giving my daughters opportunities to achieve things I never imagined possible for women in frontier territories." Rebecca nodded, recognizing that their father's support removed the final obstacle to accepting federal partnership. Their family unity remained intact while their individual prospects had been transformed beyond recognition. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the return of the federal agents, their timing suggesting careful attention to the deadline they had imposed. Sterling, Caldwell, Henderson, and Morrison approached with expressions that mixed professional interest and personal concern for the decision that would reshape 4 lives forever. "Miss Thompson," Sterling said as he dismounted, "have you reached consensus about federal witness protection and career opportunities within our various agencies?" Rebecca stepped forward, her voice carrying conviction that surprised her with its strength. "Mr. Sterling, we accept federal witness protection with career development through multiple agency partnerships. However, we do so as equal partners in whatever operations you're planning, not as subordinate employees following orders we don't understand." Sterling's smile carried genuine respect, as he apparently recognized leadership qualities that crisis had revealed and developed. "Miss Thompson, federal agents who can't think independently and make strategic decisions under pressure don't survive long enough to build successful careers. What you're demanding is exactly what effective undercover work requires." Caldwell stepped forward with documents that formalized their partnership agreements. "Miss Thompson, federal witness protection with multi-agency career development represents unprecedented opportunities for civilian personnel. You'll be among the first women to receive comprehensive federal law enforcement training while pursuing territorial development objectives." Henderson added his own perspective on the historical significance of their decision. "Miss Thompson, your family's cooperation could establish precedents for federal witness protection that benefit countless future cases. You're not just accepting government assistance, you're helping create programs that could protect other families from similar criminal exploitation." Morrison spread contract documents across their porch railing, revealing legal frameworks that defined their partnership with federal authority. These agreements guarantee individual autonomy within security requirements while providing resources for career development that extend far beyond typical government employment. You'll have opportunities to influence territorial policy while building personal wealth and professional reputations. Rebecca studied the contracts with growing amazement at the scope of what federal partnership was offering. Training programs that would establish them as qualified law enforcement officers. Business development support that could create independent enterprises. Educational opportunities that exceeded anything available through conventional channels. Financial compensation that could establish genuine long-term wealth. Catherine examined the specific terms with her characteristic attention to crucial details. These contracts appear to provide everything we discussed while preserving legal protections for individual rights and voluntary withdrawal from federal service once prosecution is completed. That's exactly what they provide, Sterling confirmed. Federal investment in witness development serves everyone's interests when witnesses become valuable long-term assets rather than temporary cooperative individuals. Margaret voiced the question that captured their transformation from desperate crisis to unprecedented opportunity. When do we begin this new phase of our lives? Immediately, Henderson replied. Federal coordination requires relocating to secure facilities within 48 hours to begin training programs and security briefings. Your personal effects will be transported separately once permanent locations are established. Sarah stepped forward with excitement that reflected her artistic anticipation of new creative opportunities. Mr. Caldwell, when would mineral surveying operations begin? I'm particularly interested in combining geological work with territorial journalism. Surveying operations commence after completion of basic federal training approximately 6 months from now. However, you'll begin learning geological assessment and territorial mapping immediately as part of your preparation program. Caldwell's outline suggested comprehensive education that would establish genuine expertise rather than simple cover identities. Rebecca felt the magnitude of their decision settling around them like morning mist, transforming familiar landscape into territories of unlimited possibility. Federal witness protection was offering everything they had dreamed about while providing security against criminal retaliation and resources for achieving influence that conventional careers could never support. Mr. Sterling, she said formally, the Thompson family accepts federal witness protection with multi-agency career development partnerships. We look forward to contributing to territorial law enforcement while building our own professional reputations and financial independence. Sterling extended his hand with the ceremonial gesture that formalized their partnership with federal authority. Miss Thompson, welcome to federal service. I believe you'll find government work considerably more rewarding than anything civilian careers could provide. As Rebecca shook hands with each federal agent, she felt the final vestiges of their old life dissolving into history. The struggling farmers' daughters who had faced auction and exploitation were becoming federal agents with authority, resources, and opportunities that few Americans ever experienced. Thomas Thompson approached the federal agents with documents that transferred property ownership and resolved legal obligations that had created their crisis. Gentlemen, I believe these complete the arrangements for my family's transition to federal protection. Morrison accepted the documents with bureaucratic satisfaction. Mr. Thompson, your agricultural management position in Colorado Territory begins next month. Federal operations take care of their personnel's families, and your expertise will contribute significantly to territorial food production programs. Margaret walked to the oak tree, where their mother had once read stories about adventures in distant lands, her hand touching bark that had sheltered 3 generations of Thompson women. "Rebecca, do you realize we're about to become the adventures our mother used to tell us about?" Sarah joined her sister beneath the spreading branches, her artistic imagination already envisioning the stories she would write about their transformation from Missouri farmers to federal agents. "Better than the adventures, Margaret. We're going to be the women who create opportunities for future generations to achieve things we can't even imagine yet." Catherine approached with practical concerns that characterized her systematic thinking. "We should document everything about this experience. Future families facing similar crises could benefit from understanding how federal witness protection actually functions versus public perceptions about government programs." Rebecca felt tears threatening as she realized their crisis had revealed strengths and possibilities that comfortable circumstances had never demanded. Her sisters weren't just accepting federal protection, they were embracing opportunities to become influential figures in American territorial development while maintaining family unity and personal values. "Sisters," she said quietly, 3 days ago we thought our choices were limited to auction, exploitation, or desperate flight to uncertain futures. Federal agents have offered us careers, authority, financial independence, and the chance to influence territorial development while serving justice against criminals who prey on struggling families. The federal agents began loading their equipment and preparing for departure to secure facilities where comprehensive training programs would transform 4 Missouri farmers' daughters into sworn federal agents with authority spanning multiple territories. Sterling approached Rebecca for final coordination of their immediate departure arrangements. "Miss Thompson, federal transportation will arrive tomorrow morning to begin your relocation to Colorado Territory training facilities. Personal effects can be shipped separately once permanent assignments are determined." Henderson added practical information about their immediate future. Training programs include firearms instruction, legal procedures, surveillance techniques, territorial law, criminal investigation methods, and communication protocols. Upon completion, you'll be sworn federal agents with full authority to enforce territorial and federal law. Caldwell outlined the scope of career opportunities that would emerge from their federal partnership. Mineral surveying, newspaper publishing, educational program development, ranch management, law enforcement operations. Your individual talents will determine specific career paths while contributing to broader territorial development objectives. Morrison provided final details about compensation and benefits that would establish their financial security. Federal agent salaries begin at $1,200 annually, with performance bonuses and profit-sharing opportunities that could double or triple basic compensation. Successful witness testimony could provide additional awards from criminal asset forfeiture. Rebecca absorbed the comprehensive nature of what federal partnership was offering, while recognizing that their decision had transformed personal crisis into professional opportunity that exceeded their most optimistic expectations. As evening settled over the Thompson homestead, painting familiar landscape in shades that suggested transition rather than ending, Rebecca stood with her sisters beneath their mother's oak tree for the final time. Tomorrow would bring departure to territories they had never seen, careers they had never imagined, and opportunities that conventional society would never have supported. "Margaret, Sarah, Catherine," she said softly, "our mother used to tell us that extraordinary women were created by extraordinary circumstances that demanded more strength and courage than ordinary life required." She paused, studying faces that had grown harder and more determined through their ordeal. "I think she would be proud of what her daughters became when circumstances demanded everything we had to give." Margaret smiled through tears that reflected both sadness and excitement. Rebecca, 3 days ago we were farmers' daughters facing auction to settle debts we didn't create. Tomorrow we become federal agents with authority to pursue criminals who exploit struggling families throughout the territories. Sarah added her own perspective on their transformation. We're not just accepting rescue from desperate circumstances. We're embracing opportunities to influence territorial development and create programs that could protect countless future families from similar exploitation. Catherine provided her characteristic analytical summary. Federal witness protection has offered us everything we could have achieved through individual effort, plus resources and opportunities that civilian careers could never provide, plus justice against the criminals who targeted our family. Rebecca felt profound gratitude mixing with anticipation as she realized their crisis had ultimately provided liberation from limitations that conventional society imposed on women's ambitions and capabilities. Federal service would establish them as influential figures in territorial development while providing financial security and professional recognition that marriage or independent careers could never have achieved. The stars emerged in clear Missouri, sky as 4 sisters prepared to leave their childhood home forever, carrying dreams that had been expanded and refined through crisis into realistic plans supported by federal resources and authority. Thomas Thompson joined his daughters for final farewells to the property that had defined their family's identity for 3 generations. Girls, your mother would have been amazed to see what her daughters achieved when circumstances demanded they become more than society expected women could be. Father, Rebecca replied, circumstances didn't make us extraordinary. They just revealed capabilities that comfortable life had never required us to develop. As dawn approached, bringing federal transportation that would begin their new lives as sworn agents with authority spanning multiple territories, Rebecca Thompson realized that sometimes the greatest disasters could become the foundation for achievements that exceeded every dream ordinary circumstances had ever supported. The auction that would have scattered them forever had been prevented. The criminals who had exploited their family would face federal prosecution. 4 sisters who had awakened to impossible debt crisis were departing as federal agents with resources, authority, and opportunities that would establish them among the most influential women in American territorial development. Her father's crisis had nearly destroyed them. Jackson Sterling's intervention had transformed them into forces for justice and territorial progress that would benefit countless future families while building their own legacy of professional achievement and personal success. The Thompson sisters were no longer victims of circumstances beyond their control. They had become agents of federal authority with power to create the kind of future that 3 days earlier had existed only in their most impossible dreams. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.